could talk about social media and the public square and why X is important or why X is not important.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's start with that. So Peter Thiel famously said a couple decades ago that we wanted flying cars when we got Twitter. And Mark Andreessen tweeted today, it turns out Twitter was more important than flying cars. So we want to really briefly recap. Well, one, do you agree with that statement? And two, what is it about Twitter that kind of enabled it to become this, what it's become?
First off, it has to be acknowledged, right, that the underlying disappointment expressed by Peter was a very contrarian one in the early 2000s, because we were coming from this massive explosion of software applications where the world of bits was organized and brought together for the first time in human history, right? For the first time in human history, anyone on the planet could send a message to anyone else. You could look up everything on an online encyclopedia. There were videos, et cetera, et cetera. There was an ongoing information revolution. And this pithy quote expresses the surprising failure of the promises of progress in the middle and late 20th century, where the assumption was that planes would keep getting faster, cars would keep getting faster and better. We would have space flight, we would have robots, we would have all sorts of other physical innovations, moving things in the material world. So the other famous statement is like bits versus atoms. I think the quote is actually true. And let me explain why I think it's true. When Thiel said that, Twitter was a disappointment, because Twitter was in a way almost a short selling of what connecting the world citizens could be. It was a highly moderated platform. I don't know if you remember, but the algorithm was very aggressive. And the political decisions, the policies, now you could argue, yes, Elon's politics also affect the decisions, but in theory, there's much less happening of the kind of quiet deboosting or information management of it, and of the big public space that is X.com, formerly Twitter. So he was expressing this interesting thing where it's isn't it such a short selling of information technology? The best we can figure out to do with it is to send 140 characters to someone else, right? That was the old limit. It's since been boosted. But so it's a fair point. It's okay, feels like email already captured a lot of this. And then to have that public space also be heavily moderated and centralized, that's also in a way short selling the potential of technology. When it comes to network TV, you just have to do it in a centralized way. It's called broadcasting for a reason, right? You blast out EM radiation that, is decrypted by your antennas and provides you television, provides you image, sound, etc. It was not the case that it was technically possible for the audience of the world to participate. And now it is. So that is why Twitter is amazing now. But I'm going to say one more provocation, and we can dig into whatever aspect you intuit is interesting, because you're of course also a Twitter user like I am, and you have your own thoughts on media with the Turpentine network of podcasts. It's a fact that Elon, in a way, made Twitter interesting. To free Twitter, he needed to spend $44 billion, which is such a high barrier to entry. I think, all the deep state guys and all the political operatives, it didn't occur to them that someone might be willing to lose $44 billion. It has a pretty high bar. I'm not sure if I had $100 billion, I'd be willing to lose $44 billion. It's easy to say this doesn't matter. And, you have so much wealth left over. Why not use it, right? Why not leverage it? But this leveraging is very tricky. You're potentially sacrificing control of existing organizations, right? And you need to rely on different modes of financing where you're illiquid, say in SpaceX or something like that. And then who are you making this deal with when you say, I'm good for the $44 billion that I'm using to buy Twitter? That might come with its own strings attached. So it's a tricky negotiation even for the richest man in the world. But the richest man in the world, let's put it this way, Elon Musk liberated bits by first mastering atoms. Without SpaceX and Tesla, he would have never had the control of an organization like Tesla or SpaceX to be able to leverage it so as to be able to, as a private individual, click that option and buy a $44 billion pillar of Western civilization. I think the only reason he was allowed to buy it was because no one in government ever had the idea that an individual could amass that and buy it. I think otherwise the government would have preemptively forbade it, because there's lots and lots of evidence old Twitter was used by the State Department and the US government. And like we can, now we can double click on any of those. And
so, yeah, there's a few things there. So first, I just want to also give some historical background. There's this great book called Hatching Twitter, which talks about sort of how Twitter, the drama of the company, multiple CEOs, so much within the company switched, even though from the outside, it seemed like they didn't change the product for a decade. And in some ways they didn't. Mark Zuckerberg popularly called Twitter they said about Twitter that they drove a clown car that fell into a gold mine. And you compared it to email, but there's something about the innovation of Twitter, this sort of that, involved a reduction of friction that just enabled more people to share what was on their mind. And then Twitter became the place where you could see what the most interesting people in the world were thinking about in real time. And then you could search by topic area and see what people were saying about that topic. And then also it became this amazing sort of discovery mechanism of interesting people. People often say Twitter is the best professional network or the best dating app because it's really a way to see who people, especially when likes used to be a thing, you could really see, inside what people care about. And so and in many ways, I feel like TikTok copied from it, Facebook copied from it. Twitter definitely didn't capture the value that it created. Social media, Mark Zuckerberg's vision was to connect the world, and Facebook has 1 billion plus users. Twitter obviously smaller, I think 300 million or something like this. But maybe filter bubbles are good. And I think what we see now is a more fragmentation, a social media fragmentation, where we're seeing alternatives to Twitter emerge in the Elon era, though it was already existing pre-Elon. There was, a Gab and Parler and kind of right-wing social networks. And now there are left-wing social networks with Blue Sky and Threads, it seems. And, my friend Dan Romero is building Farcaster, which is a crypto Twitter. But I think it's just interesting how social media originally, brought everybody into the same conversation threads. And now, there were some benefits of that, but also some real costs. And now there seems to be a more localization happening in social networks. And I think one thing that's also underestimated is the power of group chats. I feel like that still hasn't been understood as sort of a way of determining opinion, or there are things I find that Elon posts that were in a group chat. I was like, hey, what was the supply chain by which this post in a group chat got edited sort of and then shared to Elon, and then he ended up posting it, or not necessarily, or not always him specifically, but I think there's sort of an interesting phenomenon between the group chat to Twitter pipeline. But I think it's also worth commenting. Twitter has changed the politics and public landscape, I think, way more than Facebook and TikTok have, even though those platforms are much bigger. Like, it's no coincidence Joe Biden, announced on Twitter, announced on X first. Like, Twitter is the arena for elites and terminally online, elites and autists.
I mean, in a way, the two were becoming more and more the same group in the early 2010s, right? Every company that has an internet native CEO has basically positive marketing effects because of that. So if the CEO is good at Twitter, the company's marketing is usually better. That's kind of an interesting correlation. And of course, Elon Musk pushes this to the extreme, but the same phenomena existed in politics. To everyone's surprise, even though, say, Donald Trump won the 2016 election on network TV, he dominated and directed the attention of the country's journalists who hated him on Twitter. And you know what? Haters are fans too. One of the most interesting things in politics is when you study voter behavior, turns out name recognition is almost all that matters. You know that AI paper, attention is all you need? I think in politics, name recognition is all you need. Like if you just have universal name recognition, then you are a political player if you're in politics. And that's kind of wacky. And I think this is also why in Europe, you sometimes see these meme parties. In the US, you don't have meme parties, but you do have meme politicians, right? The Pirate Party in Sweden was a meme party. The Five Star Movement in Italy was like launched by a comedian. That's usually because the barriers to entry are lower. In the US, you had RFK, right? MAHA is now a thing, Make America Healthy Again. And also this interesting pivot from the Democratic camp to the Republican camp, where the fans follow him. I don't think people realize how unusual that is for a politician. You always have had politicians that have crossed party lines, but people go from Democrat to Republican, but it's mostly about switching teams where the teams are more popular. But here we see a personal political audience go there. Let me say something like, relatively controversial. AOC is an example of a left-wing politician that is very good at social media. If AOC, after, she becomes a mom, shows up and start putting TikToks and how she now cares about men's issues and how actually it's the bureaucrats that are the enemy, I think she could go all the way to the center right and keep up to half of her current fan base. I think they would go with her. About half of her current online fan base would go with her. And you see this on a smaller scale with various personalities, right? We know on Twitter, there are frequently people that try to rebrand themselves from like super right to left or from left to right, and they carry a lot of their audience with them. I think that's a new phenomena of the social media era. And perhaps this is the light at the end of the tunnel that stops this fragmentation you were describing, because you did correctly note that there were, when Donald Trump was first banned from Twitter, that produced right-wing social media. It was kind of not that successful, but successful enough. And now that, Elon's in control and Trump's been unbanned, the left-wing social media, and it's like successful enough, though still not that important. That suggested that there'll be a polarization of totally separate social media. But I think the conversation will keep coming back to the largest possible audience just because of Metcalfe's law, right? I think Metcalfe's law is stronger than partisanship. So if we blame the internet for excessive partisanship, we have to understand that this partisanship and mutual fighting can only happen on the same platform. So I don't think it ever proceeds to like digital secession. I think it proceeds to like the digital Thunderdome. I think that's sort of what X.com is. And within that Thunderdome, your fan base, well, maybe you can flip their political valence. If I was a Democratic Party operative, they could just pay me money to do that, but they're not going to. They're too dead player for that. I'd be like, you know what? Only Nixon could go to China. Only Hillary Clinton can talk to the Tate brothers. So for real, the bros, the sort of right-wing coded MRA influencer class, they would sell out for a morsel of public endorsement and attention. Did you see how long, and maybe we already raised this earlier, but did you see how long Joe Rogan waited before he endorsed Trump? To the last possible minute, because there were active negotiations that Harris would come on his show. So there's a media incentive, even if let's say 80% of Rogan's fan base or 60 or 70% of it is Republican leaning, he had that incentive. And you see other phenomena like the Young Turks sort of pivoting rightward and keeping their fan base, right? So these are interesting dynamics. I think the future of politics in the US might be the headhunting of strong personal brands. In a way, that's what the Trump team did remarkably well this cycle. They got Tulsi, they got RFK, they had Elon. Even JD Vance is like a more of a niche flavor, but he's grown into being a personality online, but he was respected among intellectuals. Dude, that's kind of like a dream team. Not necessarily a dream team to run the country, though that would be pretty cool if they did run the country. That has bureaucratic blocks to it. It's very hard to elect people to run a country. Turns out democracy is more of an aspiration than a reality, but it's a dream team in terms of brand, like agglomeration. It's oddly almost it's like let's call it, it's like feudal electioneering. It's sort of like do personal deals and diplomacy with key individuals with their personal brands and get them to bring the audience with them. And the classic example of the celebrity endorsement, I think it kind of doesn't work unless the celebrities build up like a political following. So Taylor Swift endorsing this or that side matters, but much less so than, say, if Oprah was currently a social media personality and she endorsed this or that side, even though she's also was a great media phenomena. I think like I think she might be the richest African American ever, or has someone else beat her by now, but extremely successful self-made businesswoman. In her endorsement of Obama mattered even in the network TV era, where she owned her own network, right? Like she created the whole talk show phenomenon. So anyway, the thing here that I'm building towards is this concept of we should actually start seeing an outsized influence that is assuming the absence of censorship, an outsized influence of media personalities. Now, in Europe, this phenomenon will be limited by the speech laws that exist where, did you see that stat about, okay, I'm going to look this up because it is such a controversial number. I actually don't want to get it wrong. I'm going to now compare the United Kingdom to Russia. I don't think we disagree. Russia's not a free country. You don't get to say what you want. You will get in trouble if you say the wrong thing online. There were 1,449 persecutions and then 98 convictions for internet speech in Russia from 2008 to 2017. So 2008 to 2017, that's a period of 9 years. Over 9 years, a little under 1,500 people were brought to criminal charges. And about 100 of those were convicted. So that's in Russia and the Russian Federation. By contrast, during the same period in the United Kingdom, which I'll remind you has a smaller population than Russia, by like about half, maybe more than half, there were 1,700 persecutions. So 1,696 persecutions and 1,400 convictions. It's kind of insane that, I think from this we should conclude that Britain is not a free country. And I think this sort of points to something I wrote about. I wrote this article that was supposed to be a warning back a few years ago. The title was, "The Centralized Internet is Inevitable." Now, Elon, of course, is proving as a live player that he can, challenge inevitability, as can other live players. But the thesis I had there is that the West was sliding into the same model that China has, right? And if you look at European censorship, it's not too far away from the political censorship you see in China. And this actually also changed my mind as I've observed this great divergence between the United States and other Anglosphere democracies. It sort of changed my mind in favor of the explicit constitutional guarantee of the First Amendment. Now, of course, if the cultural underpinnings of the legal formula are undermined, and if you check, younger generations tend to be less pro-free speech than older generations, then over time you could redefine it even here in the United States. And eventually the constitutional guarantee stops working and becomes dead letter. So fundamentally, constitutions still have to be embodied in the political economy of a country. They can't just be a legal theory or formula. But it really, I do think the US internet was kind of saved by the First Amendment. It gave us time for this change of corporate policies. And, today in the US, the sort of worst excesses of cancel culture have sort of weakened. That doesn't mean that the country is less woke. It just means that it's less virulent about it. And you're less likely to get fired for expressing yourself and your thoughts online, which was always, by the way, a very strange paradox at the heart of American economic life.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. How deep do you go to seek out an answer to a question? Maybe you've spent hours clicking the source links on an obscure Wikipedia page. Or maybe you're even the type of person who checked out the entire shelf on the topic at your library.
If you're nodding along, then check out GiveWell, an organization that researches questions about global health and philanthropy, even if a satisfying answer might require years of reviewing studies, talking to experts, and over 300 footnotes. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Erik Torenberg at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Erik Torenberg to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lanahan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For back-end, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
Okay, why does your boss have to have opinions about your politics? He's your boss at work. Why should your boss be censoring you or punishing you career-wise for your political expression as a free citizen? Again, in a notional republic, in a notional democracy. It's really weird if you think about it. Why were it was almost this like, there was a call for cancellation, and if the person wasn't fired, it blew over. But if the person was fired, it was almost like a conviction. People would like stay away from them socially, right? Like they were canceled properly. So it's kind of bizarre that corporate decision makers were like a moral court in that way.
And not only corporate, but too, like even on dating apps, people don't want to date people who vote for Trump or the other side. Like, do you think did we experience peak polarization these past few years between the parties, or do you think it's only going to intensify in terms of the sort of dislike and hatred that Democrats and Republicans have for each other, and the sort of both like socially, professionally, etc. Sort of
I explained earlier, while they will hate each other, but they'll hate each other on the same platform. Like in bulk, they'll stay on the same space and yell at the other side because that's where the fun is. But also that's where the network influencers want to be. So say like a Tate, or much bigger than him, like Rogan, they want to have the widest possible reach, right? Like, or a Mr. Beast wants the widest possible audience. The basic effect is still largest in cities that are also physically, demographically segregated. So I think the polarization will continue to intensify in cities like San Francisco or New York or cities like Miami, to give a right-wing example, one of the few right-wing examples, where you physically encounter mostly people from your tribe, right? But if you're in a more mixed environment, you might still consume the same polarized media, but it is moderated. So what I think will happen, there will be a divergence between the polarized regions of the United States and the unpolarized regions. And this has its own analog in Europe, where I suspect that people in, say, Berlin or London or Paris will be much more polarized than people from Frankfurt or Edinburgh or Marseille, because in the capital, whatever the self-sorting effect along class lines, education lines, professional lines, political lines, that tends to be much stronger in areas that are, very competitive, and in cities. The larger the city, the stronger this effect. So first-tier cities around the world, I expect to be fairly socially and politically polarized, usually but not always dominated by one political option. And then second-tier cities, I think we've reached saturation. So I think for a while, all cities and all even rural areas and towns were moving the same direction. And now I sort of feel only a few cities are going to continue in this direction, only a few of them, but the rest will possibly even be less polarized, right? Because I think that there was an initial great sorting, and there was a surprising effect of the echo chamber. And I think now everyone sort of knows that they're in an echo chamber. So there's like a little bit of a cultural adaptation to it, unless it's driven by other factors. Again, in super competitive professional contexts, I think politics, like maybe cancellation is over, but people basically feeling that it's okay to discriminate against other employees on the basis of politics, that's going to continue, because the moral foundation is now there. This kind of like bring your whole self to work thing, even though we walked it back a little, people, they still try to hire people who agree with them politically. You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say that's actually economically inefficient. And it's actually kind of bizarre, because how can you have a like Republican or representational form of government if the consequence of politically being active is this sort of like economic penalty, right? And I think the bigger the corporate bureaucracy, the worse this effect is. And the harsher the competition is, like the more elite a university is, the more elite a company is, the more vicious these fights get right below the surface.
It's interesting. You alluded to this idea that maybe AOC, she could become center right and still keep, majority of her audience. And
I mean, the rebranding almost works itself, right? She has, even demographically, it's like, I think her boyfriend is like a white American. So her kids might have blue eyes, man. That
was her Pascal's wager. No, I'm just kidding.
Sorry. Okay. I'm not following her dating life. I'm sure there are some conservatives who are following it close.
Exactly. There's all the photos of her and Elon sort of, AI generated together.
That's the ship the internet wants. It's the most entertaining outcome. It will be the most entertaining outcome.
What's interesting, I guess, does that imply that basically center-right ideas just have more product market fit right now? And if you could put them with sort of a left aesthetic, or the left tribe just adopts them, they could sort of get more votes that way?
Dude, if you try to be a Bernie bro with social media following, you could do it today. You could do it. You would have to endorse like a few things. Imagine you come out swinging and you say that Christianity offers men a bad deal, and that actually corporate capitalism offers men a bad deal, and that actually what we really need is to like take care of the men who are economically falling behind. Like, you can get people behind redistribution. Like, it almost writes itself. I feel people lack political imagination, because when you start spouting, if you spout propaganda, I think you start believing it. And then what was once a convenience becomes like a habit. And people's models of the world, if you're busy producing content and if you're busy doing politics, eventually you do lose touch with people. Like, you have less time to consume. Even at the highest level, and it's not populist politics. Like Henry Kissinger said, that a political office consumes rather than builds intellectual capital, right? So there's a way in which this is almost inevitable, and there's always this opportunity to find whoever is most in touch with the present moment and see the opportunities there. Now, I could also say from a right-wing perspective, there's massive undersupply. The Republicans do way too much gatekeeping. There's like so many of these personalities. Like, you can tell. I'm not going to go specific into companies, but for example, have you noticed that several of the defense tech companies have kind of taken up like Republican adjacent aesthetics?
Yeah, Palantir, Anduril, et cetera.
Exactly. The American flag, or even smaller startups, right? American flag, or like even like kind of rehabilitating Raytheon from being like an evil merchant of death to a now sadly dysfunctional, but like great American company, right? Like you might have people just like talk about it. And that wasn't the case in Silicon Valley 10 or 20 years ago. And by the way, the language I used, which was very negative language about Raytheon, like I guarantee you that's how software engineers talked about this stuff in the early 2000s. Like, I don't know if that shared your experience, but that was my experience.
Yeah. Totally.
And so that's there. And then I think people are more friendly now or willing to voice their support for what the internet was. There's like almost a desire for walking back this like recentralization of the internet. Like everyone still vaguely remembers how free the internet felt in the 1990s and early 2000s. And they're kind of tired of this long era when the internet felt super corporatized and like airbrushed and like managed and regulated. And they feel more excited about the wild frontier again. So there's a desire to open the digital frontier and, you know, maybe make a buck in the process. But I think this shows that there's like an undersupply of serving these ideas, because even if you're just pursuing it as a business, it just makes sense to go with these ideas right now because it'll be a good brand. And I'll attract talent and customers and all of that.
A few years ago, my company contracted a European branding agency, and our company was sort of investing in startups, and they wanted us to go with sort of a message that said, hey, it was very sort of understated, almost like apologetic, and almost like, you know, hey, we're not pompous Silicon Valley people thinking we're doing good work and changing the world. And I was like, wait, no, this is like the opposite of what, like, we're trying to be proud of what we do. Like, you know, I know Zuckerberg apologized post-Trump, but like this is a different era now. And so I say that as a segue to why are they so apologetic in Europe, or why are they so sort of instinctively, culturally more focused on harm prevention than on, you know, so say freedom of speech? Like it still feels that like they haven't made the transition, or they just feel something in a deeper way. Is it as simple as they're self-hating? You know, how do you sort of explain this or psychoanalyze this?
There are a few things that are happening. First answer, Europe is just older than the US. So I think at an elite level, American gerontocracy is worse than European gerontocracy. But in Europe, the voters get a surprising amount of what they want. And the voters are old, right? The voters are very old in Europe. So this just means that like it's not even political conservatism, it's a conservatism of ways of being, right? You know, we can talk about people in Congress not using email, but you know, the median voter in Germany has probably never used TikTok. The median voter in Germany probably has never used Twitter, right? Like, I think if you age America for 10 years, just increase the average age of the American public by 10 years, you would see Americans be less open to innovation. In fact, that's one of my great worries with the graying world, is that there are people who are less cognitively flexible, who are more invested in legacy systems in a personal way, right? They want to keep the fax machine. They don't want to go to email. They want to keep email. They don't want to shitpost in the group chat. They want to shitpost on the group chat. They don't want to communicate corporate goals through a silly TikTok dance. I mean, there's always a future shock coming. You are never future proof. You could be 20 right now, whatever you're doing right now, 40 years from now, you will be conservative and you will kind of hate the new thing, like on average, right?
Totally.
You can be like, no, the group chat is the best way to run a company. It's like the best way to run a company. Like, I hate this dance shit. How can you communicate KPIs through a dance? That makes no goddamn sense, right?
Exactly. We got to think it's the fall of civilization.
No, exactly. And everyone feels that it's the fall of civilization. And then sometimes you're right. Sometimes civilizations do fall.
And the dance thing, I do think that is the fault.
You're not always right, but sometimes you are. Sometimes they do fall.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the first reason why Europe's more conservative than the US. The second reason is Europe basically tried to lock down fascism and communism after World War II by basically flash freezing the process that destabilized Europe politically. Because the simple fact is, when Europe industrialized, when it went from agricultural to industrial, you saw places like Germany, Italy, France, Russia, like rocked by instability. Now, there were other causes such as, the traumatized veterans of World War I. But if you're looking at Europe and you're like, oh, wow, Weimar Germany, you literally had like communists and Nazis. It's like, okay, we have to restrain capitalism, but let's do it in a way that's not totalitarian. Why do we have to restrain capitalism? Because capitalism drives industrialization, and then industrialization produces these weird political side effects that threaten to wreck society, right? So, and then you kind of come to this implicit deal. I'm not sure modern Europeans understand it unless they're very educated or have thought very carefully about their own system. Just as I upset Americans, I also upset Europeans, where if you have inherited wealth from an industrial family in Europe from the 1920s and 30s, and your country didn't go communist, you are fine. Your family's fine. There's a nonprofit foundation that owns your company. You get to pass on as much wealth as you want. If you have income but not capital, your income is capped very seriously. So in other words, class mobility in Europe is actually kind of frozen. And the deal is we get to have a class-based society, but everyone at the various levels has about a comparable living standard. And the lie embedded in this is that this means that it's not a class-based society, right? Because you can have radically different levels of power, right? Even if you have comparable standards of living. And also, you relate to the world very differently. So in Europe, I think the remnants of the old aristocracy, the early industrial fortunes, personal liberty and rights, all of this was kind of protected by this social democratic formula where you have an egalitarian exterior, but a political economy where you strike a deal with some national champions, some legacy companies, national champions. Okay, the state is going to protect you. I don't know, IKEA, or the state's going to protect you, Krupp or whatever. And in exchange, you're not going to lobby against these like owners' labor laws. And you're not going to give us a bunch of unemployed people who are going to vote for communists or Nazis, okay? You're going to keep them employed. We're going to set owners' laws, and you're going to agree to those laws, and we'll champion you. And in a way, that's the deal that worked. America has its own deal, which is very different, though arguably the New Deal was trying to instantiate something similar, but the politics played out different. So the key problem of Europe is Europe cannot be dynamic without a revolution of the political economy. We might not call this a revolution politically. It might not result in violence, but you got to give it a different political economy. Now, thank goodness I actually think we don't have to be totalitarian in modern Europe. So that's the silver lining of having a very old population. Old people tend not to be totalitarian. They're busybodies, they're oppressive, but they're not going to go march in the streets demanding like war or something like this, or demanding physical violence against landlords or something like that. Like the old population of Europe is not predisposed to revolution. Also, I think this like flash freezing of the capitalist process in Europe, it kind of happened at a point where Europe was already done being agricultural. I think there's a massive shock that happens when you have a mostly rural population become mostly urban. That, I think, by the way, is one of the strongest reasons why China is discouraging people moving from the agricultural hinterland into the big cities. You would think that, they should be encouraging internal movement in China to bail out the real estate market in China, which America does this through mass immigration. America perpetually bails out its own real estate market through mass immigration. So China could, in theory, bail out its ghost cities just by giving permits to 100 million Chinese peasants to move to Shenzhen or whatever. That would bring up prices. That would create demand. But they don't do it because I think as good Maoists, they understand that this mass of people would be suddenly alienated and prone to political radicalization and only have tenuous investment in the system that they joined. So all of Europe was like China today in the 1900s. All of Europe was like mostly farmers suddenly becoming factory workers, right? But today, most of Europe are factory workers. The unions aren't mobilized. The factory workers are in their 50s. There's a service economy that's politically fragmented that can't even mobilize the same way that a factory floor does. So really, I think if you dismantled the intentional cast around Europe that is supposed to stop it from going fascist, I think, to the disappointment of some of my, super right-wing friends and to the relief of my center-left friends and center-right friends, I don't think it will go fascist at all. But it's really, really hard to make that case. So that brings me to the third reason. I think in Europe, it's sort of like, it feels like they are living at the end of history, and America is a wayward child that has taken a detour and stayed in capitalist land for too long. Like, I think the European bureaucrats' perspective is like, well, we take global warming seriously. And look, we now understand that you can't do too much immigration, but you can't cause people to do babies. Sure, maybe there's too much crime, political correctness, etc. on the margin, but we're going to make it work. And eventually America's going to end up in the same place. And, I think this kind of end of history mentality, if your elite has it, it's very hard to beat. Now, America has its own version of the end of history mentality, but I feel the last 4 years have really broken open, in a good way, like jailbroken, the American political imagination. Like, people now are excited about building physical things again. You couldn't get them to be excited about that 10 or 20 years ago. 10 or 20 years ago, a factory closing was in America, not just in Europe, seen as progress. Like, you might remember that era, right? It was like progress if the coal miners stopped mining coal and if we stopped making cars in Detroit. It's a new era. We're doing things with computers now. It's all on the cloud. But now it's sort of like, okay, we do things with computers now, and isn't it exciting? We're now going to have robot workers in our factory. And, maybe it's not going to be in Detroit. Maybe it's going to be in Texas. But that's the change in mentality that happened in America. And I think this is actually to its credit and its resilience. So I think the real American dynamism isn't its economy, and I'm very skeptical of the economic numbers. The real American dynamism is the ability to reform its political institutions. And the first European country to show the ability to reform its political institutions, open up their political imagination, escape the mental prison of the post-war consensus, the post-World War II consensus, I think it's going to stun everyone. I think it's going to be an unleashing of immense potential. So, in other words, I believe in European potential, even if the Europeans don't yet see the need for it.
So you think it's possible that there will be a vibe shift in
Europe?
Yeah, that could match what we see in the US.
And in fact, the US might lead it. Consider, Erik, how do you feel as a European if you're posting the same things as your American friends, and they are your friends because you're talking to them all the time, and then the police officer shows up to knock on your door? You feel outraged. You're like, what? How? And in fact, people in Britain are outraged now. If Americans were not free to speak online, so if Americans, they wouldn't be going to prison, but if Americans were silent because they're afraid of losing their job, sort of the European doesn't feel FOMO and doesn't feel terror. They don't feel oppressed because they don't realize this is unnecessary oppression. They don't realize this is an arbitrary exercise of power. But if they see that people are freer in America, that starts offending them. They're not mad at Americans for being free. They kind of become mad at their own government for why in the world are you doing this? So in fact, I think there'll be a thawing. Either that, or Europe is going to have, a digital iron curtain will have to fall across the Atlantic Ocean. That could happen. But if you do that, if you start having a fight over digital rights, right? If you say, for example, block Facebook, block x.com, block Instagram or whatever in Europe, and at that point, you're actually hurting the American economy. It's very hard to do that, given how the US leads the world in this. You need access there. So if you did that and you create, I think at that point, Europe-US relations start taking a hit. And the question is sort of is that worth it or not? Now, if the US turns its back on its free speech moment and goes back to algorithmically or otherwise censoring its own internet, then this liberalizing tendency in Europe will have a hard time coming into being, because then America's economic weight and political and military weight will be on the other side of the equation. So if a European country tries to break free, while America is not free, America, they won't see itself this way, but it will in fact be that country's jailer. Because they don't know anything about Polish politics. They read in the New York Times that the Polish prime minister is a Nazi. Okay, I guess that's what is happening. Bad man. Bad man, we have to change this. We have to put pressure on the government. Our friends in Paris and Berlin will tell us what our soon to be again friends in Budapest or Warsaw need, won't they? And you remember this. This is how politics was done 10 years ago. That's how it was.
Yeah. It'll be our own an Arab Spring, but in Europe, and it'll be.
We can look forward to it, but hopefully it'll be more functional, right?
Yeah.
The Arab Spring, it didn't work out for Libya, but I'm really hopeful because look, there's immense talent in Europe. We see this every day because we see all of these startup founders that come here to the Bay Area, right? A lot of them have great technical expertise, great drive, and I think that even the United States would be better off just economically if the other half of the free world became freer, but also became more technologically progressive. Let's remember, Ozempic is European innovation. How many Ozempics are we missing because Europe is dysfunctional? We would benefit from those,
Maybe related to our conversation today, but segueing a little bit, there's been this conversation that the left needs its own Joe Rogan. Is that kind of not even wrong? Is that misunderstanding the problem, or talk a little bit about sort of that, what goes behind that phenomenon? It does seem that a lot of indie, interesting, intellectual online culture has come from the right in the last few years. I'm curious, what could the left respond with, or how do you make sense of that phenomenon?
I think partially it's a talent funnel where all the elite positions of left-wing control, such as, for example, being an editor at the New York Times or being an anchor at MSNBC or something like this, all of those were positions that were really competed over, right? So there was so much talent trying to get into the institutional center left and further left positions of power that had been built up since the 1960s that there was just so much competition. It was harder to succeed and stand out. With the same level of talent, if you go from left to right, you will have less competition. The right has, in America, in a Republican context, had an immense anti-intellectual bias. Their think tanks are like a joke compared to center-left think tanks. Objectively speaking, the Republican Party does not invest in its own intelligence because it kind of doesn't need it to win elections. It would need it to govern the country along their espoused ideals, but hey, that's a separate matter. So the right-wing institutional positions, they were pretty locked down on a kind of nepotism and were not very meritocratic and were so much less prestigious that people didn't want to go into them. However, when we look at below the institutional line, you didn't kill your career by being edgy and super left-wing online. You can literally, you can tweet, kill all CEOs, and nothing bad happened to you, which is kind of interesting. The right-wing version of that, bad things could happen to you, and I don't endorse either, right? But I think that because of this, the large audience of people who are privately feeling more to the right, but couldn't say it in their professional lives. So the educated sort of right-wing class of people, I think they felt they had no voice, they had no one speaking their language. So anyone who did make their way below the institutional line online to put a center-right message and put it out coherently instantly had a huge audience and had very little competition. I mean, Erik, who was Jordan Peterson's competition when Jordan Peterson first showed up?
I don't even remember. Maybe sort of the other Manosphere content, maybe. I don't
know. Not even. Before he went to Manosphere, he was a psychology professor talking about Jung and not automatically taking a left-wing perspective. And it turns out that in the entire Western world, there was only one charismatic, non-left-wing guy doing that and talking about personal growth and then applying it as a final step to the lives of young men. So that's early Jordan Peterson. Look, isn't it kind of crazy? And he only did that after he got into political trouble in Canada, which was also a Streisand effect, right? where that sort of propelled him. And then people are like, oh yes, he also is oppressed the way I feel oppressed, where I have to like not talk about how I feel about the world, where I have to agree to lies to get along, where, I tried to go to therapy and it was like kind of useless and et cetera, et cetera. But this Dr. Peterson, he explains it so well. I did clean my room after watching his lectures, someone might feel and say. So I think this is why I think we are far from equilibration. I think you could continue to make massive brands if what you're thinking about is serving the information and education needs of a center-right audience. Just to say some things explicitly that I usually wouldn't say is sort of like, I do think that there's a version of right-wing slop. And I know, for a fact, like we're on a podcast, so I'm just going to break the fourth wall and be like, I know we could grow this better if we did like left-wing slop or right-wing slop. But, I don't care. I'm not going to agree to that. I'm going to give the nuanced position that, can evolve, but I'll always give like what I kind of think is my position. And I think the most important thing that we can do when in the context of participating online is sort of trying to provide signal in the noise. Since people chasing their own pre-existing biases, or these often, frankly, nonsensical political coalitions where you have mutually contradictory opinions that exist in the same political coalition, be it left or right, and that they have to pretend to agree, I think that dynamic is like deeply toxic. Still, merely by not being left-wing, one does get a boost right now in like organic demand, because so much of the institutional stuff was left-wing and had been left-wing since before we were born. Like people were talking about a left-wing bias of the media in the 1970s, okay? This has deep roots. It was a long wave. And maybe now the wave ends if the institutions fail, or it continues if the institutions adapt. And say the New York Times at least did adapt to the internet. The New York Times is once more profitable, even if, say, the Washington Post is still in trouble.
What I was going to ask is, to that point, do you see an underground sort of independent subversive left emerging? I like there were some people who, when sort of Mark Andreessen, and crew endorsed Trump, said, oh, this is the top for, like, to the extent that beliefs are fashions, do you see sort of a independent left emerging, or is there so much sclerosis in sort of the sort of left-wing supply chain that it's unlikely that in a few years there will be, all these left-wing posters who are saying all these interesting things?
I think currently, if you're a talented young person on the left, your belief is that I should be quiet and I should work for a baby boomer, and I will write the baby boomer's tweets and I'll write the baby boomer's memos, and the boomer gets to have all the credit. So basically, their political imagination is still too influenced by two modes. It's influenced by, the West Wing as your ideal model of power. And number two, it's sort of canceling your racist uncle over Thanksgiving, which just doesn't work anymore. That sort of Maoist moment where the masses of the people politically attack the other side of the masses of the people and change social norms, that moment's past. So I think it'll take disillusionment with both. And it's kind of tricky to be simultaneously disillusioned with both. You need a left-wing theory of action to do so. So if someone were to crack a political formula where you explain in a way that's grounded in meaning and experience to intelligent, young, let's say, let's put it this way. I think the left wing, the West Wing idea of getting power is it's not wrong if you have a Democratic Party president. It is wrong if you have a Republican Party dominated government, right? Like it doesn't work then. But I don't think center-left millennials will ever break out of this mind prison. But I bet Gen Z will. So I suspect because Gen Z just values popularity inherently, and there are popular left-wing memes on TikTok, for example, there will be a personality that starts off as just chasing attention, chasing clicks. And then one day the Gen Z person wakes up, she or he wakes up, and they're like, wait, I have enough. they feel satisfied. So there'll be, I predict, an activist turn from basically people who are post-economic or post-attention. We have the term post-economic when someone's like super rich, kind of don't care about making more money. I think even in our social media driven attention addiction age, there's like a level of attention that satisfies even the biggest egos. So I think there are people who will go post-attention. If you want to have a sense for what that is, it's like, I don't know, check out Pamela Anderson's social media. Massive star from the 1990s, early 2000s. She spends her remaining capital on causes she believes in, animal rights, et cetera, and actually does like a decent job communicating it. I think you will see randomly someone like Mr. Beast, who happens to be a left-wing person. I mean, if he is, I don't know if he is, but if a Mr. Beast type who happens to have a particular belief held strongly, they'll suddenly one day they'll turn on, and suddenly they'll be the most important political voice of the left. And it's not because they will have planned it the way you might if you're like thinking of it as a West Wing operation and you're like going to get in the White House, or if you're thinking of it as like, I'm going to cancel my uncle, and after I cancel my uncle, then I'm going to cancel Donald Trump, which sounds insane, but it's kind of like, it's only slight hyperbole for what the social justice plan of action was, isn't it?
Yeah. And it worked to some degree.
It worked to some degree when everyone else did it. It's like, if everyone in China jumped at the same time, there would be a pretty big earthquake. I think America had its pretty big cultural earthquake, right? Like half of the country jumped and the other half trembled. But, the point here I'm making here is that someone will amass a massive following and then at one point will redeploy it. The attention pivot will happen where, let's say if Elon did the money pivot, Elon's like, I'm making money, I'm a businessman, I like the Obama administration, holy shit, the country's falling apart, I'm now a Republican. And then the money was deployed to like liberate Twitter, et cetera. I think that moment's going to happen for the attention economy, and it's going to happen on the left. So there'll be someone that's like truly huge, like Oprah big, and they're going to start it's going to be underground branded. You might be like, oh, but how could the most famous person in the world be the face of an underground counterculture movement? I'm like, well, currently the richest man in the world is the face of an underground counterculture.
That's what people are so perplexed by Trump. They're like, how could Trump be speaking to all this?
Yeah. And like, arguably Trump is the most famous person, et cetera, et cetera. So Trump's of course more famous than Elon, but I was more thinking in terms of Twitter and X.com. So I think that's how it will happen. And I think smaller things will exist. Like, I think there'll be bubbles within bubbles. Like if you hang out with like enough like center-right contrarians, you soon realize that there's like always a smaller faction who knows all of the say Peter Thiel, et cetera, arguments, but are now counter-signal them, and they're like, they have their own left-wing spin on it. So here's a fun one. If you wanted to start a left-wing cult in Silicon Valley, start promoting left-wing interpretations of René Girard. There, bam. Free ideas. I mean, I'll give more to the right too. So we stay nice and politically neutral. I'll just keep throwing it out, and people will pick it up, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Pick up the weapons, ideological weapons.
Totally. Well, that could be, that free alpha could be a good place to
free political alpha.
Yeah, exactly. Could be a good place to wrap. This has been a great conversation on social media, on the European vibe shift, on sort of the future of left-wing culture online, especially. Samo, as always, a great conversation. Until next time.
Great chatting, Erik.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.